My name is Eli Sagor. I'm with the Cloquet Forestry Center at the University of Minnesota. And I'm really glad to welcome you all here for what I think will be a really good webinar. We've got two presenters today, Ron Moen from the Natural Resources Research Institute, part of the University of Minnesota Duluth, and Dan Ryan, who is a district wildlife biologist with the Superior National Forest. Ron is going to talk about northern long-eared bat, a species that has been of great interest to many of us for the last several years in particular. And then Dan is going to talk a little bit about Canada lynx and update us. Our hope is that by the end of the hour, you'll have good current science, good information about the status of these two species. There's a lot to pack in, and I don't want to talk for long, but a couple of things I want to say just briefly again for those of you who just joined. If you have questions for either speaker, please share those using the chat function on your screen. It's best if you share those with everyone, but if you have a question you'd rather everyone didn't see, please share those with me, with Eli Sagor. Again, share those with Eli Sagor or publicly if you can. And don't wait until we pause for questions because our time's a bit compressed. And so it's best if you can type those in before we pause for questions. We will, for those of you who are interested in continuing education credits, watch for a link as you exit the webinar, or Caitlin Wilson, new to the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative, will be posting that link near the end of the webinar. If you want to get credit, you do need to complete that continuing education credit request form. With that, I'm going to hand the floor to Ron Moen. Again, Ron is with NRRI at the University of Minnesota Duluth, here to talk about northern long-eared bat. Ron, you're on.
Okay, thanks, Eli. Yeah, and so I'll talk about northern long-eared bats and also the other species that we have. If I can get focus on the screen and go to the next slide. And the reason why we're interested in the bats, of course, is white nose syndrome, and it truly devastates bat populations. So this is a map of its spread. You've probably seen some version of it before, and one of the things that's important that I added to here, this is a little brown bat migration. There's actually a Hibernacula up here going 570 kilometers, and that is why it can spread like this over time. The other thing I added to this map is 6 million dead bats in the first 6 years that it was known. And then we've had another 8 years as it's spread into these areas. And we have no estimate of, there's no published estimate of how many bats have continued to die. And the reason that I'm talking about this is we got started on a project funded by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund in 2015. And the focus species there was the northern long-eared bat. And historically, there was about 2,000, it's thought, northern long-eared bats that hibernated at the Sudan mine. And the other species that hibernate in caves that I'll talk about are the big brown bat, little brown bat, and tricolored bat. We got this project started in 2015, 2016, white nose syndrome hit. By 2019, there were no mice found, northern long-eared bats found in the Sudan mine. In 2020, the survey was canceled. This was and is the largest bat study in the upper Midwest so far. And we did, because of the timing, document the decline. As you can see here, there's lots of groups involved. It was us at NRI, the Minnesota DNR, the U.S. Forest Service, and then Camp Ripley also did work on this project. And we created 4 summary technical reports that are available. I'll cover some of what's in them today, history of northern long-eared bats in Minnesota, and then the telemetry we did, roost trees, and acoustic detection. Some of this is now in peer review or being prepared for peer review. And one of the important things is that this is Minnesota specific data. And one of the things you'll see is that the northern long-eared bat is kind of a generalist bat that adapts to different conditions. So first I wanted to show what we really documented. So there's a couple tables here. Mist net capture rate, and this is in northeastern Minnesota. In captures per 10 net hours, here's the northern long-eared bat. We went from 2.35 down to 0.2 captures per 10 net hours. This is a little brown bat. It actually remained consistent. And then the other species were less frequently captured. As a percent of captures, you can see the numbers also declined for the northern long-eared bat. Stayed relatively constant for the little brown bat. So that was the mist net work. We also did acoustic detectors across northeastern Minnesota. And here again, you can see this is consensus identifications. I'll get into that later, but northern long-eared bat, we haven't even detected them with consensus identification in the last couple of years. We actually did here. This is rounding. This one is actually, we didn't detect them. Little brown bat, also a decline. So we saw the decline in acoustic detectors. We didn't see it in the mist nets, but that took longer as well. And this is the two species together. And percent of deployments. So this is kind of an indication of space. 10% of the deployments, we had consensus identifications of the northern long-eared bat in 2015, none in 2019. And the space presence of the little brown bat is the same type of decline. And to repeat it, this is over area. So more of the locations that we use. And again, the same type of decline in consensus identifications for northern long-eared bat, little brown bat, and then the percent of identifications among all the species. And finally, again, the space use, the deployments with the species present also declined more for northern long-eared bat than for little brown bat. And this is something that has occurred range-wide. So it started in the east and moved to the west. And these are the Minnesota bat species. And I looked at cave, mistnet, and acoustic studies, 28 different publications, 16 states. Annual decline, and this usually happens for about 3 to 4 years in these studies, is about 30%, more than 30%. Little brown and northern long-eared are what we see mostly. The tricolored bat, relatively rare. In our project, the big project, we only caught one in the entire time. And then the other, this is a cave bat species, and then these are tree bats. They've remained generally consistent. There's very little data on the silver-haired bat, so that 42% increase is probably an anomaly. To talk a little bit about the specifics of what we did, mist nets, you can see the spatial extent of the project. We saw the same change in species composition over time. So because white nose was just hitting, northern long-eared bats declined. We saw kind of variable in the little brown bat, and then the big brown bat increased. And we caught about 1,200 bats in this entire project. All groups. We attached radiotransmitters to find roost trees. This is an example of the radiotransmitter attached to the back of a bat. And one of the purposes of this was to document when we had northern long-eared bats lactating. So mid-June to the end of July is when we picked up lactating bats. We also wanted to find out the roost trees that the bats were using. And this is one example, about 30 feet up in an aspen tree. Roost height ranged from 0.2 meters to 20 meters high. And roost type, about 3/4 of them were crevices or cavities like this, 14% were in loose bark, and another 10% were broken branches and trunks. And one of the things we did find is that the females were switching roost trees every other day, even with young that can't fly yet. So they're moving within a 200 to 300 yard area, carrying them to a different tree. Also wanted to document trees that were types that were used, and this shows the adaptability. So in southeastern Minnesota, mainly oaks and maple acer genus, and then as you move north, you switch to maple and aspen, and as you get further north, most of the roost trees were aspen. And this also shows the adaptability of the species in terms of over here in South Dakota, they're actually roosting mostly in conifers, as opposed to here in Minnesota, 90% deciduous and 10% conifer. In terms of size, the roost trees were a little bit bigger than in the random trees that we measured. And you would expect that, and you would also expect the trees to be not as healthy because they need to find these cavities, and it takes time and also lack of health for those cavities to develop. A little bit about space use. So here's kind of one extreme, and again, it shows how the species is northern long-eared bats are pretty adaptable. So this is in southeastern Minnesota, and this is where the mist nets were set up. And we had some bats that went to these maternity colonies that were in relatively contiguous forest. And then we had some that were on the edge of a forest. This would be another colony. And then we had another colony down here that was over on the basically on a peninsula out in the middle of farmland. And that is in contrast to what you would normally see in northeastern Minnesota. So contiguous forest, and this is the mist net site. And what we often saw is they would go up to about 1,000 yards from the mist net site to the roost trees that they used that night. And then we went to followed that bat because it had a radio transmitter on it, and we found these clusters of roost trees, and that's nothing new. That was known before too, in terms of they don't stay in one single roost tree. The types of areas that they're selecting. So if you look at like a landscape, you've got mature forests, you've got clear cut here, wetland here. And what we looked at was basically a tree dominance. So this is land fire, satellite derived cover type. And we also looked at other potential variables. Anything that was related to the percent of tree cover would show a similar pattern to this. And the easiest way to think about it is, so here's the entire area, northeastern Minnesota, northern superior upland ecological classification system. In half of the area at the midpoint is about 65% of this tree dom variable. And then when we went to the around the roost trees, we did a 5-kilometer buffer and said, what is the landscape like there in terms of this tree cover? And we see the same thing, but it's up to about 75% for the 50th percentile. And then what bats are actually selecting is even more. So the 50th percentile for bat use is 85% value for the tree dom. And essentially the absolute value matters less than what they're picking searching out is higher canopy cover. That's one thing. But then in some cases, they're also using relatively low canopy cover. And the reason why we did this is to kind of create a map of this is potential areas where bats could be. So greater than the minimum would be here, this first roost tree, and then the 10th percentile, 25th percentile, and 50th percentile. And what you can see is that they would be able to use all of these areas that are dark shaded here. Predicted no bats using the Pagami Creek fire area, for example. There could be a few patches in there, or the Seven Beaver area, or the iron mines. But they're able to use the forested areas here. But the other thing is that the preferred areas where more than half of the roosts were are actually relatively isolated. But they're able to, like I said, they're adaptable enough to go to these more open areas as well. A little bit about acoustic detection. So this is where they're distributed in space. We use Kaleidoscope and Sonobat are two different programs, and then we use what we call the consensus identification, where both Kaleidoscope and Sonobat agreed. I put this up with all 5 types of IDs to show that they're relatively consistent. So northern long-eared bats, less than 5%, no matter which identification scheme you use. Little brown bats, 50 to 60%. And then the other species over here. This is pre-white nose syndrome, or as it was happening. So what we would see now is little brown bats would be further down in terms of percentages, and so would the northern long-eared bat. What we see when we deploy, and this is kind of it's more of a biological, how do bats use space. So we put out a detector and deploy it for 4 or more nights. And because what happens is that on individual nights, sometimes there'll be no calls, and that's because they're foraging in a different area. For the little brown bat, about 20% of the nights there was no calls, 20% there was 1 call, and then we had 5 to 10 calls per night. And what we're sampling is about a 20 meter by 20 meter by 20 meter cube with the detector. And then on some nights we had lots of calls. And if you look at all of the deployments over time, this is what you see. A lot of nights there's relatively few calls of many species, but then there are some nights where we get 20 to 25, even up to 400 calls per night. And little brown bat now would be more over here. We see changes over time in terms of, these are the identified species. No ID is about half of the calls or more. This is when the young bats are flying around in August, and they're also getting ready to go back to Hibernacula, that we see a lot more bat calls per night. By region, little brown bat more common in the north than in the south. Big brown bat more common in the south than in the north. Now, one thing about Hibernacula and Summer habitat, how far do bats spread? And this is where I'm going to end. We've got the Sudan mine. Northern long-eared bats generally go up to about 60 kilometers and to 100 kilometers away from the Hibernacula. So if they spread out to here, what we're going to look at is kind of roost tree sites and can they limit population recovery? And I think the answer is probably not. And this is why. We've got 2,000 bats hibernating in the Sudan mine, arbitrarily double it to be conservative, and then add 25% to account for other Hibernacula. So that's 5,000 northern long-eared bats, 2,500 females. And we found in the project 15 females per maternity roost colony, which means that there would be 2,500 divided by 15 is 166 colonies, maternity colonies. And we found the area of that maternity colony was about 7 hectares. And so they would need 166 times 7 is this many hectares or this many kilometers squared. And if we look at older stands that are within 60 kilometers of the Sudan mine, we got almost 500 kilometers squared of older stands compared to about 12 kilometers squared of the actual maternity roost home ranges. And that's kind of relatively small when you think about it. It's almost like a needle in a haystack type thing in the area of the entire circle, and this would include some younger stands, is 11,000 kilometers squared. So a few things to think about are the spatial patterns and distribution, that they will use the younger stands here, and we don't have a large sample size in some of the different cover types, but bottom line is that there seems to be lots of roost trees available. Future directions, looking at migration corridors, DNA bat diets from fecal DNA, the diets. Project on UMD, we found no northern long-eared bats there either. And then also building some bat houses. So that's it.
Excellent, Ron. Thank you very much. That was about perfect timing. Our plan for this session was a presentation by Ron ending at 12:23. Then we're going to transition to Dan Ryan. Dan will give his presentation and then we'll do Q&A for both speakers at the end. Feel free to submit your question anytime. I see that somebody raised their hand, but the way to submit, maybe that was a mistake or whatever, I don't know. But the way to submit questions is to type them into the chat pod. Ideally, send those to everybody. Dan, whenever you're ready, you can share your screen and begin. I'll remind folks, our second speaker is Dan Ryan, District Wildlife Biologist with the Superior National Forest, and he's going to focus today on Canada lynx. Dan, you're on.
All right, do you see the screen good there?
Yes, it looks perfect. Go for it.
Okay, so District Wildlife Biologist on the Superior. I work out of Aurora. Been involved in some way in lynx kind of since I've been here, since the early 2000s. This is probably a talk Ron could have given because he did a lot of the initial research on lynx here in Minnesota and has quite a few publications on it. It's also been, you know, a big team effort. We've had a lot of people working on it. So I'm just going to start with a brief description of lynx biology, discuss habitat management on the forest, and finish with the monitoring that we've been doing. So Canada lynx makes its home in the northern part of North America. Because of its large feet and thick fur, the lynx is well adapted to living in areas with cold winters and deep snow. Its large feet work somewhat like snowshoes and enable the lynx to walk on top of the snow rather than post hole into the snow like animals with big bodies and small feet like deer. Their historic range extends from Alaska across much of Canada with southern extensions into parts of the western United States, Great Lakes states, and New England. Currently, there are 5 known geographic regions in the United States that support resident populations: northern Maine, northeastern Minnesota, northwest Montana, and northeast Idaho, north central Washington, and western Colorado. To give an idea of how many lynx we're talking about, there have been estimates for these different areas of 750 to 1,000 lynx in northern Maine, 50 to 200 in northeast Minnesota, 200 to 300 in northwestern Montana, northeastern Idaho, 30 to 35 in central Washington, and 0 to 10 in southwestern Montana, northwestern Wyoming, and 100 to 250 in western Colorado. But I'd like to spend just a minute talking about the lynx-snowshoe hare relationship because it's critical. The ranges of snowshoe hare and lynx are nearly identical across North America, and snowshoe hare are the primary prey for lynx. The Hudson Bay Company fur trading records first documented a cyclic 8 to 10 year oscillation in lynx populations, which they found also corresponded with similar fluctuations in snowshoe hare. Since that time, studies in both Canada and the US have provided further evidence that lynx populations are tied to the cyclic abundance of snowshoe hare. Lynx density, home range size, dispersal patterns, reproduction, and survival rates are strongly tied to snowshoe hare abundance. The reason for this is snowshoe hare can have up to 4 litters per year with 1 to 4 young produced per litter, plus they're not very territorial and they have small home ranges. With optimal habitat conditions, snowshoe hares can have high rates of population growth, which is great for the lynx. But eventually the hare population reaches a point where there's not enough food to support it, and then the population crashes and the cycle starts all over again. There are many other species that prey on snowshoe hare. Other predators such as bobcats, coyotes, fisher, red fox, great horned owls, northern goshawks, and mountain lions are able to suppress hare populations at the edge of their range, like here in Minnesota, making it more difficult for the lynx to successfully compete and persist. Almost all the information on lynx habitat use in Minnesota came from the NRI GPS telemetry study that Ron was responsible for, and the years for that was generally 2003 to 2008. Winter can be the most difficult time for many predators when food is scarce and hunting is difficult. Cold, snowy winters are important to the lynx for one major reason. The deep snow can prevent other predators that are not lucky enough to have snowshoes for feet from successfully hunting. Because the lynx is specially equipped with very large feet, it has a competitive advantage over other predators hunting in deep snow. The primary forest type that supports snowshoe hare in our area is spruce fir, pine, and mixed deciduous forest, as well as conifer bogs and shrubby swamps. Young stands of these forest types are important, as are older stands that have a dense mixture of evergreens, such as spruce and fir, mixed with shrubs and young hardwoods in the understory. These are ideal for hare, who feeds on a variety of shrubs, young trees, and grasses. So in reality, lynx will hunt in a variety of different forest types and ages, dictated completely by where hare are found. One other important part of lynx habitat is where it dens. For lynx denning habitat, forest type and age does not appear to be as important as what kind of structure is underneath the trees. Lynx tend to den in areas where there are plenty of down logs, such as a blowdown patch or root wads under thick, dense cover. During the first few months of life, kittens are left alone at these sites when the female hunts. Down logs and overhead cover provide protection of the kittens from predators such as owls, hawks, and other carnivores. Also, for denning habitat to be functional, it must be in close proximity or adjacent to foraging habitat. So now I'll just go a little bit into talking about the Forest Service specific habitat guidelines and kind of what rules we're under with our management. Lynx were listed in 2000. Also at the same time, the Lynx Conservation Assessment and Strategy came out, which contained recommendations for habitat management for lynx, and they were incorporated into the Superior National Forest Plan in 2004. Also, critical habitat was designated in 2006. So there's a list of standards and guidelines in our forest plan that we need to follow whenever we're planning any of our projects. We have standards and guidelines dealing with foraging habitat, denning habitat, connectivity, unsuitable habitat, and also roads and trail density. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of these. First, I was just going to talk about the main unit that we measure our habitat variables on, and those are lynx analysis units, or LAUs. And these were developed, it's kind of a national system. So on a lot of the national forests, they broke the forests up into these areas. And so They were developed to generally approximate lynx home range size. And so the objectives for these LAUs in our forest plan is on National Forest land, manage vegetation to retain, improve, or develop habitat characteristics suitable for snowshoe hare and other alternative prey in sufficient amounts and distribution so that the availability of prey is not limiting lynx recovery. On this map, the overall gray shows where critical habitat was designated in Northeast Minnesota. The crosshatched shows where we have lynx analysis units. And these green show there are some areas that were not included in critical habitat for different reasons, but shows where we have Forest Service land that doesn't fall within critical habitat. One of the standards that we follow is within a single LAU, we do not allow more than 15% of Forest Service land to become unsuitable in a 10-year period. And for our model, unsuitable would be stands that are 4 years or less in uplands and 9 years or less in lowlands. So this is so we continue to provide habitat in these LAUs without harvesting too much. And generally, that's a pretty easy one for us to follow. We've had a few areas where, due to forest conditions, that we've harvested more and we've approached the 15, but we haven't exceeded it. There also is another standard that no more than 30% of an LAU on all ownerships would become unsuitable in that same time period. And that's one that we haven't really got close to. So the Superior also has a guideline that says within LAUs and National Forest Service land, moderate the timing, intensity, and extent of management activities, if necessary, to maintain required habitat components in lynx habitat. So we do look at foraging habitat impacts in every LAU with every project that we do on the forest. This slide shows the amount of foraging habitat forest-wide based on our model. Our model shows mature conifer or hardwood conifer mixed stands and stands between 5 and 20 years old, generally representing these conditions. It does show a slight decreasing trend based on harvest levels and natural disturbance. So we also have a guideline on denning habitat, which is following a disturbance on National Forest Service land greater than 20 contiguous acres, such as blowdown, fire, insect, or disease, that could contribute to lynx denning habitat, generally retain a minimum of 10% of the effective area on National Forest Service land. Coarse woody debris, down logs, or root wads are the common habitat components used by lynx for birthing and rearing young. In our model, mature forest, age greater than 60, represents these kind of conditions, even though Ron did find dens and younger stands in this that had a lot of coarse woody debris and down logs. Road and trail density is another metric that we measure when we're doing our project work. 2 miles per square mile for road and trail density was a threshold that was developed nationwide as part of the Lynx Conservation Assessment and Strategy. And we do have a guideline that says within LAUs generally maintain road and snow compacting trail densities below 2 miles per square mile to maintain the natural competitive advantage of lynx and deep snow. 2/3 or so of our LAUs are below that 2 miles per square mile. And we do look at this whenever we're doing project planning. And if we know we're in an LAU that has a higher road and trail density, we look for opportunities to decommission roads and trails or just not add any new roads and trails in those LAUs. So now we'll talk a little bit about lynx monitoring on the forest. A lot of this began after the NRI GPS collar study and was initially mostly DNA data collection. We then kind of modified it to get at population trend monitoring. The objectives for our monitoring program here in the Superior have been to document reproduction, to look at distribution, which we have used quite a bit in our project planning, especially when we're doing our larger vegetation projects. It's good to know what areas are kind of more core areas that are being used heavier by lynx. So sometimes we do less harvest in these areas until we wait for other areas to kind of get back into some good lynx habitat. We also have kind of been helping out the DNR on a lot of their stuff to kind of let them know when they're looking in areas that have a lot of lynx activity. Some other objectives are to get at persistence, hybridization, and population trend monitoring. Number of protocols for lynx detections have been used nationwide. Our methods have evolved over the years, primarily as a result of funding and manpower, but mainly involve winter snow surveys. A lot of the work's done by Forest Service biologists, volunteers, and the University of Minnesota Wildlife Club, where we've had up to 30 students a winter kind of helping us over a 2-week period. And I know that it's kind of been nice a few times. We've had the students, I know the very first week they were up here, temperature never got above 0 and the snow was 3 feet deep. And it's kind of nice to sit in the truck and point in the direction I wanted the students to go out and collect scats for us. So that worked out good. We've surveyed up to 2,600 miles of roads or trails for our occupancy survey each winter. We trailed 40 to 77 miles of tracks for our sample collection each winter. So I'd like to start by discussing the genetic work that's been done in the forest with differing levels of intensity since 2000. We do send our samples to the Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Wildlife Genetics Lab in Missoula, Montana. We follow tracks to collect scat, hair, and sometimes urine. We get tissue samples from incidental mortalities. The NRI study got blood samples, and then we were able to identify individuals by a microsatellite analysis. Blood and tissue have had almost 100% success in identifying individuals. But to get that, we either have to have a dead lynx or one trapped. Scats have been about 85% successful, and hare has been between 40 and 60% successful in identifying individuals. We have over 1,500 confirmed lynx data samples currently in the database. Almost 99% are from Cook Lake and St. Louis County, partly because that's where we look, but mainly it's because that is where all the lynx are. You can really see they're focused kind of there in northeast Minnesota. DNA is also used to document reproduction. Reproduction was first confirmed back in 2002, has been confirmed every year since then by the DNA work. Since 2010, we've documented 111 kittens from 31 mothers, and 75% of the time we've also been able through the DNA to know who the father was. We've ranged from 1 to 7 family groups per year. It's kind of interesting, I don't have the results yet, but this last winter we had, up to 13 families and at least 20 plus kittens. Not having all our results back yet, so not really sure why we all of a sudden seem to have a lot of reproduction. But so this really is kind of a minimum estimate of reproduction. Quite often we miss getting DNA on some known families, or we don't get DNA on all the kittens. And we also have large blocks on the forest that we aren't really able to survey, like the Million Acres and the Boundary Waters and some other areas that don't really have any road or trail access. One of the things it's shown us is the importance of Minnesota-born lynx. 6 of the previous 17 mothers were known Minnesota-born kittens, and of those 11 others, I mean, some of those I'm sure probably were also born in Minnesota. The DNA has allowed us to track back 4 generations of Minnesota-born lynx. We had a couple kittens a few years ago that we were able to track back to probably 2003, and some of the first cats that Ron put radio collars on. Also shows us that some of these lynx are responsible for a lot of kittens. I mean, we've had one female 390 who's been around for 6 or 7 years, and we've documented at least 14 kittens from her from 5 different litters. And it's kind of the same with fathers. We had one one male L28 who we know fathered at least 16 kittens from 4 years with 5 different females. We had a male this year who bred with 3 different females and had at least 8 kittens just this year. DNA monitoring has also given us information on persistence of lynx in Minnesota. 21% of lynx not originally identified through mortality were detected in subsequent years. It's even higher with kittens, where we've been able to find 30% of our kittens in the future years. We do have a few cats over 6 years old. The 2 oldest cats currently in the database were females that we identified as kittens, I think 7 or 8 years ago. DNA has also given us information on Lynx-Bobcat hybridization. In our database, we do have 13 individual F1 hybrids. All of them that we've documented have offspring of male bobcat and female lynx. These hybrids that we've identified have lynx-like ear tufts, intermediate size hind feet, and tail coloration. It really seems to vary by winter severity. If we have 2, 3, or 4 years of kind of low snow, we tend to find bobcats starting to come into some of these deeper snow areas, and that tends to lead to more hybrids. But then if we have a couple big snow winters, the bobcats seem to not be able to survive and are gone from the area. So we started with trying to standardize the genetic work we had been doing to give us some population trend info. So we started working with Beth Gardner and Nathan Hostetter, who are currently at the University of Washington. We started documenting survey effort and came up with the dynamic occupancy model, which shows spatial and temporal variation in occupancy and kind of shows our detection probability across all years. And it does account for survey effort and conditions. This model will also be part of the main method of monitoring lynx as part of the post-delisting monitoring effort in the Midwest region, since lynx are proposed to be delisted, but we'll have to monitor for 10 years after that. Recently, this survey method was published in the Journal of Diversity and Distribution. So if you want more information on it, it's in there. We've done it since 2015. It's a grid-based system, and the survey area roughly matches the Superior boundary. This figure shows the grids that were surveyed by year. So the spatial covariates that are driving occupancy and persistence that we've used, and we're trying to kind of look for better variables whenever we can find them, were percent evergreen trees, which had a positive relationship, average snow depth, which we got some historic snow depth data from the NOAA data set, and then a couple LIDAR metrics on mature trees and mid-story. These figures show the spatial part of the occupancy from the model. The graph in the bottom right shows the occupancy trend through years. 2014-15 was a year where we ended up finding a bunch of new males in areas where we usually don't have lynx, and we assumed there was kind of some type of Canada influx that year. We haven't analyzed 2019-20 yet. It's going to be interesting because I think we will see a slight decrease in occupancy. But like I said before, we found more kittens than we've ever found. This slide shows the factors influencing occupancy, persistence and colonization. Initial occupancy was during a high year, probably from that Canada influence. All the variables for initial occupancy showed a positive relationship. Persistence, which is probability that a grid that's occupied stays occupied, had a positive relationship with deep snow areas and high evergreen components, and a negative relationship with mature forest. Colonization at the bottom here is an unoccupied grid cell becomes occupied, did have a positive relationship with mid-story. This graph kind of shows the same thing, just shows it through the years. This low persistence, I think, had a lot to do with the previous year, which was really high. I think a lot of those cats left, so it dropped down. But it shows that, since then, persistence has stayed pretty good, and occupants or colonization has gone up a little bit. We've also used our DNA information to use a Mark-recapture model to give a population estimate for a subset of the forest. We worked with Shannon Barber-Meyer from USGS Northern Prairie Research Center on that. This graph shows our yearly population estimates just for areas that were consistently surveyed during those years. So it doesn't include some bigger parts of the forest, such as the boundary waters and other areas we just haven't been able to get to. So the Mark-recapture has not really shown evidence for increase or decrease in abundance. It has shown that the density estimates for the areas that we surveyed have been extremely low, 1 lynx for every 250 kilometers, and that's 7 to 10 times lower than densities in northern populations at the low of snowshoe hare cycles. So this shows at the top our Mark-recapture trend lines compared to our occupancy survey trend lines, and you can see that they're pretty similar. They started up, went down, and are coming back up. It's something, the confidence in these point estimates varies among years and models. So future efforts, we're going to try to integrate both these models. We plan to continue doing them, continue to come up with some kind of annual population estimate. We're constantly trying to refine our occupancy model. We're hoping once we get some new LiDAR data, we can come up with some better metrics to identify snowshoe hare habitat. We're also looking at using our all lands geodatabase, which has stand info across all ownerships. And we're trying to see if there's a way we can put harvest activity and come up with some kind of threshold for that. One other thing we've done this last winter was tried some spatial capture recapture methods, which should give us some kind of explicit density estimates. Part of the funding we've used is we have 10 years of funding from Polymet to be used for lynx monitoring. And with that, we'll try probably every 3 years to do a little more intensive effort, kind of like we did this last winter. So I know we went through this kind of fast, but if you want any more info, get in touch with me, or you can look up some of Ron's published work on lynx and also some of our papers on occupancy survey and Mark-recapture. I'd like to thank people on this list and everyone else that's helped us, and I think that's all I have.
Excellent. Dan and Ron, if you, up to you if you want to, whose slides get shared at any time. Why don't you both activate your video, and we can, we'll just do questions for both of you now. And we do have a number of questions coming in, some really, really good detailed questions. Let's start with, and a couple of these are things that we can share some information about. There was one general question about, can you say more about white nose syndrome? And Ron, since the next question is for you as well, I wonder if, of course, you can discuss that now, but if there's a good resource that you want to share in the chat, maybe later on we could post that to the event page for general information about white nose. So your call how you want to answer that. But I'm going to throw another one at you. So talk about white nose if you want. And then Ron, how do your, oh goodness, I'm trying to keep these straight. Northern long-eared bat, MYSE findings, how can those be incorporated into forest management, especially regarding timber harvest during the roosting season? What are the implications of your findings for, to incorporate the research into forest management, especially regarding timber harvest during roosting season? And for the implications also on the change in ESA status of northern long-eared bats. So there's a lot there. Ron, you got to unmute.
Just
yourself.
unmuted. Yeah,
There you go. Great.
Okay. Yeah, there is a lot there. I'll I'll try to answer some of it. The white nose syndrome in generally, WNS.org is the place where I got that map, and they've got some pretty good information. In terms of the findings, I think that, you know, there's a couple of important parts of it, and one is the types of trees that are chosen in the area in terms of the dense, thicker canopy cover. So there's those specifics which say this is where you can expect to find northern long-eared bats, and from a management perspective. But then on the other hand, when you've got a 90% decline in the population, they're relatively rare on the landscape. And I think that's the thing that implementing the ESA with it. I think that I know the DNR is working on a habitat conservation plan now, but the problem is, and the same is true for lynx, we know the types of habitats that they use, but they're relatively rare on the landscape. And how do you kind of manage with that knowledge, you know? Because like I said, when we put out detectors now, we're rarely picking up northern long-eared bats. So it's kind of, boy, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but I'm posing the problem. So I don't know if there's a follow-up, or if Eli, you can have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I'm not sure what to add to that. I guess I'll let the original questioner follow up if they would like to. We do have a number of other questions coming in. Another one about bat house design that I wonder if we can follow up with later. That might be another one that we can share a link to. A question for Dan. Dan, your slide on occupancy correlations is interesting. Does it suggest that lynx like balsam fir understories, but not dense, mature white and red pine?
Well, they definitely like dense balsam understory. It seems like wherever you find that, it's there. I think kind of, I mean, Ron can talk to this too, but I know we found areas of young red and white pine plantations that had a lot of snowshoe hares for some years, and then it kind of grows out of it and doesn't really provide good hare habitat. But it seems like once it does get old and mature again, as long as there is that kind of mid-story underneath it and it is thick, we do have some areas that, you know, have a lot of hares and a lot of lynx. But if it's, you know, more of a thin red pine plantation, we really don't find snowshoe hare in those mature stands.
Okay, great. A really interesting question here. Do lynx den in man-made dozer piles of slash? What can a logger do to benefit lynx while logging?
Well, again, this could be a Ron one. I think I remember going with you to a den, and that might have been in a young forest and was kind of in a slash pile.
Yeah, I went to enough. In theory, they could. What they would most likely choose if a logger wanted to benefit would be like simulate a wind throw, and have 10 to 12 trees blowing over, just cut over, because what they used most of the time in Minnesota was under the tops of wind thrown trees. I've got that one report that summarized every den that we found.
So big brush piles. Great. Question about the best of design of a bat house. Ron or Dan, any specific design suggestions on that?
Well, the ones that the one that is used most, if you were to do a search on Rocket Box, it's basically the one that I had the picture of, which is it's called a rocket because it's a it's a square that goes up, and there's 3 or 4 openings in it. So that's the one. But the problem with that is it's pretty heavy and tough to put up. The one that usually put on buildings is more of a, and if you search on bat houses, you'll see, but it's just 3 or 4 vertical panels that are actually only about 1 inch apart that the bats crawl into, and they're lighter and easier to attach.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions at this time. If I missed any, or if there were any follow-up, feel free to type those in again. While I'm waiting to see if other questions come in, I'll mention a couple of things. Caitlin has just shared a link to the continuing education credit form. So as I said earlier, if you are interested in continuing ed credits for attending today, if you're watching live, we're not able to give credit for recorded presentations, but I want to draw your attention to that. You will need to click the continuing education credit request form link that Caitlin shared. And we ask you to do that pretty soon here this afternoon. We also are always interested in webinar feedback. If you have questions that we didn't get to, suggestions on how to offer better webinars or do things better, Caitlin also shared that link, and you can find that just under webinar feedback. Question just came in from Mark. Any bobcat predation on lynx kits?
Probably a Ron one too. I'm not aware of any from back during the project. How about you, Ron?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any either. One of the things, and I think you pointed this out too, Dan, and well, based on the data, is that the kittens seem to survive quite well up until the first year. They get through the first winter. The mom is able to do that, and that would indicate relatively little predation.
Another question that I've heard come up, although I haven't heard it come up today, and Dan, you talked a little bit about lynx distributions, but so my understanding, you might correct me, is that lynx are pretty abundant in Canada. How do we, and that you talked about how their populations are pretty highly variable in Minnesota based on hare populations and how that fluctuates. How do we interpret abundance information? Is the population in Canada really robust? Is it not so robust? What does that mean? Maybe it's nothing at all because of the way the ESA is structured, and maybe it shouldn't be, but does that change anything about how we think about lynx abundance here at the edge of their range in Minnesota?
I mean, I think the way the ESA is done, it doesn't come into play too much. I mean, a lot of our species are at the real edge of the range.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's contractions and that kind of thing, but we still try to do what we can to provide habitat for them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're at about our time. Ron and Dan, I want to thank you both for really good presentations. We didn't give you much time today, and I appreciate your making it work. I do see one more question, so maybe we'll take that before we sign off. Oh, gee, now we got a couple. But this has been a really good question. Why don't we plan to answer these two, and then we'll cut it there. If folks have further questions, they can submit them either to me by email or in other ways. Ron, are you able to see that question? Follow up on the ESA?
Yeah, I'm reading it, yeah.
Go for it.
Started in a mature, while it was occupied. That's
yeah, maybe we should read it because I guess attendees can't see it.
Oh, okay.
If someone started timber harvesting in a maternity roost area while it was occupied, would the bats be able to move? Oh, I see. Yeah. Or would they likely be killed?
Well, here's my quick answer. Based on our telemetry data, where the females are moving essentially every day or every other day to a new roost, they would likely be able to move the pups to a different tree if they weren't killed when the tree was fallen. So that's the biological one. or biological answer to that. And then the issue, of course, becomes when the pups get too heavy, or most of them have only one, the mom wouldn't be able to carry the pup. So there'd be a period in there where it would be extremely difficult. But it only takes them 4 weeks to fly.
And okay, great. Thanks, Ron. Final question here is about climate change impact on lynx. Anything you want to share there?
Well, not really an expert on the modeling and all that, but you know, if snow conditions and temperatures and everything, if snow conditions go down, temperatures increase, I mean, the range is going to contract, and you know, the boreal forest, which is what they use and what the hare use, could, you know, be gone from Minnesota, or just be a lot more limited in scope.
All right. Well, with that, we're now past 1 o'clock. I want to thank our two speakers, and I also want to thank all of you attendees for joining us. Really good turnout today for two good presentations. We'll have the recording up within about 24 hours. And again, if you're interested in continuing ed credits, look for that link. I just copied the link that Caitlin shared earlier and put it in one more time. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for joining us. I'm going to sign off.